Miles Donahue, thank you so much for joining me.
Of course, thank you for having me.
I would be curious to know, what do you think philosophy is?
Well, it's interesting you ask, because I just finished a conversation with Keegan Keltson, and he's very big on continental philosophy, which I'm not. And so my tradition in philosophy is analytic philosophy. And I'll leave it to the continental philosophers to define what they're doing. But analytic philosophy is relatively straightforward to nail down at the highest level of generality. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. And so it can be characterized as the rigorous, systematic pursuit of answers to life's deepest questions. I think that gives you a snapshot of the discipline at the highest level. And then you can break that down further and define philosophy in terms of its subdisciplines. There are four major divisions of philosophy, and that would be logic, epistemology, ethics, and metaphysics. So logic is the study of proper forms of argumentation, deductive logic and inductive logic. Epistemology is the study of the ultimate foundations of knowledge. How do we know what we know? How do we know that we're not strapped into the matrix right now in a simulation rather than in a real physical world of external objects? What is the nature of truth? Is truth what is useful, or is it correspondence with the external world? Those sorts of big picture questions about knowledge and how we can have it and whether we can have it. Metaphysics is about what is ultimately real. So one obscure aspect of metaphysics is determining if abstract objects exist, things like numbers or concepts, or mathematical objects like sets and properties, propositions. Do those things actually exist as sort of objects in their own right outside of space and time, or not? That's a major metaphysical question. Or more pressingly for most people, does God exist? That is at base a metaphysical question. So what ultimately exists at the most foundational level of reality? And often metaphysics will overlap with physics. They're both interested in what is ultimately real, but often at different levels. And then sometimes at the most foundational level of physical theories, you just are overlapping with metaphysics. And so a good scientist or physicist ought to have some training in metaphysics in order to answer their physical questions. So that's my hot take there. And then ethics is the study of the good and the right. What are our moral obligations? Ethics itself subdivides into normative ethics, which is can we construct general level theories about how to get the right answer to various moral dilemmas? Is it just the consequences of actions that determines whether or not some action is right or wrong? Or are certain actions intrinsically right or wrong, regardless of the consequences? That's a major question of normative ethics. And then metaethics is the most, I suppose, foundational aspect of ethics, which is what is the nature of good and evil, right and wrong? Are these objective statements that are valid and true independently of human opinion, or are they purely subjective, reflective of the speaker's tastes rather than anything in the world itself? Those would be metaethical questions. And so at that second level, you can see just by listing off the subdisciplines what philosophy is about. And then I suppose a third and final way of characterizing the discipline is noting that philosophy is often a second-order discipline of various first-order disciplines. So, for example, philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics. In that capacity, philosophy functions to examine and articulate the assumptions of various first-order disciplines. So, just to give one illustration, philosophy of science is not an exercise in science as such. It's rather stepping outside the scientific paradigm and set of methods and asking, for example, how can we know that scientific methodology connects us to truth about the world? Does it? Should we be scientific realists that construe our best scientific theories as approximately true? Or should we be scientific anti-realists, which might say, along the lines of constructive empiricism, for example, that our best scientific theories are empirically adequate, but they're not necessarily true? So that gives you an idea of the way that philosophy often functions as a means of assessing the assumptions and the foundations of various first-order disciplines. So there you go.
Okay, thanks. I think it's really detailed and precise, exactly analytical.
Yes. So exactly. I think I've very well characterized analytic philosophy, but I would be the first to admit that that's only half of the picture of what goes by the name of philosophy. There's also continental. And as you'll gather when I post that interview, I don't have a very high opinion of continental philosophy, so I have got to leave it to them to characterize that one.
Mm-hmm. And so if I want to summarize more or less what you said broadly, maybe I lack precision here, but the first part was kind of a search for truth to try to find what is the fundamental ground of the things that we often take for granted. And on the other side, it's really a methodology. There is a certain way that you can create, develop, or raise questions about certain topics that enable us to investigate those topics more precisely, right?
Right. That's
so
right.
On this, if there is the search for truth, I saw your interview with Joe Foley, and at some point you talk about the red pill, blue or red pill, the one that gives you access to the world.
Yes.
And you said that in your opinion, we shouldn't always get the red pill. We shouldn't find out what the truth is. So here I see maybe a paradox a bit. On one side, you're studying philosophy. It seems that you're very interested in it. And the other side, maybe finding truths, the fundamental truths might be also a challenge for us.
So I think the contradiction is only apparent, but it still reveals something interesting and maybe disagreeable about my viewpoint, which is that I don't think that the truth for its own sake should always be our goal. Well, I should state that more carefully. I do think that the truth should always be our goal, but that's because I am convinced, whether for good reason or not, that the truth is something worth knowing, that the truth about life, the universe, and everything is a good thing, that it's something that wouldn't reveal the ultimate absurdity of all existence. And for that reason, I'm committed to uncovering the truth. But were I to discover, for example, that absurdism was true, that there's no meaning, purpose, or value in anything that we do, and that the only serious philosophical question is, should we commit suicide, for example? If everything was ultimately absurd, and I were given the choice to swallow, say, the blue pill, and have all of those insights erased, and perhaps slot myself into the matrix to live out a pleasurable life that, maybe wasn't perfect, but was sequestered away from knowledge of the absurdity of the real world, I think you'd be foolish not to take that blue pill. And so what that makes me think is that the truth is something to be pursued only if it's something worth knowing. And if absurdism is the ultimate truth, we should do everything in our power to keep ourselves away from that knowledge. And people push against that, but I think when you think it through carefully, it makes a lot of sense. And so then, why am I committed to philosophy and the methods of uncovering the truth about life's deepest questions? Because I think that the truth is worth knowing. And if I became convinced that it's not, I would no longer do philosophy. So I think that's how you resolve the inconsistency.
I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you're a theist, right?
Yes.
I'm kind of this agnostic that said, I wish I could believe because that would bring me a lot of baggage that would be beneficial for me. Some meaning, some moral realism, and so on. As I see it, since you're exploring the questions through philosophy, you also take the risk of maybe going through investigation and finding out that there is no God, maybe it's absurdism, existentialism, and so on is real, and you would lose this perspective.
Our choice, though, of conceptual possibilities isn't limited to either theism on the one hand or absurdism on the other. So I think that in terms of my web of beliefs, my belief in God is very close to the center, but it's not the absolute center. At the absolute center is the conviction that life is worth living. And so that belief, while entailed by theism, the reverse is not true. It's compatible with other views as well. So, for example, I've been studying axiarchism, which is a fairly abstract thesis that, there's a metaphysical principle that good states of affairs are ethically required to exist, that the universe exists because it's good that it should. And there's this metaphysical principle that, dictates that everything that exists has to be at base good, however you break that down. Now, you might find that an extravagant thesis, but I would adopt that before I adopted absurdism, even if I were convinced by Paul Draper's recent book, atheism and the problem of evil, that there's no God. I wouldn't immediately jump to absurdism. I think there's also a very real possibility that I would maintain my belief in that general claim about life's meaning, but not be able to tell you the details of where it comes from, right? I think all of us only know part of the picture. And so I would say in that case, I think I see this part of the picture, that life is worth living, but now I see far less of the bigger picture. I don't know how it all fits in, but that's okay.
So that means basically you have one option in the end, one result from your thinking that you kind of put away. It's life is fully absurd, but there's many other options that are available, and in the end, you would rather choose another one if you find yourself in this situation.
Right. So I hope that at least makes me look more open-minded than I might otherwise, where I'm not saying I would never be an atheist, or maybe even never be a naturalist. I would never be an absurdist. I think that is true as a descriptive claim of almost everybody. I think very few people have the constitutional capability to like actually consistently swallow that pill. So I think I'm just saying the quiet part out loud, that the vast majority of people and philosophers actually think, for whatever that's worth.
So you really see philosophy as a practical guide. It's not only an intellectual activity, something that is enjoyable, but you try to align your beliefs with the findings that, or what convince you, the arguments that convince you.
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely both. I have the aim of refining my beliefs, making them more accurate, supported, coherent. At the same time, I do find the process of thinking about really abstract, difficult philosophical questions enjoyable. It's an intellectual puzzle. I look at, for example, like my process of writing a paper. I'll find something that I can't wrap my head around, some issue, some argument that I think is wrong, but I can't figure out why. And the paper that results is my putting all of the conceptual pieces of the puzzle together into one coherent assessment. And that is fun. So the puzzle is solving the puzzle is just as much a motive as these kind of more admirable goals of, getting at the truth.
And do you have an example of an argument that forced you to change your beliefs?
I'm sure there are several, but one that immediately comes to mind is my previous commitment or acceptance of skeptical theism. So at the highest level, skeptical theism asserts that our observations of evil and suffering in the world are no evidence at all of atheism. They're no evidence at all of God's non-existence. And why is that? Well, because for the various reasons skeptical theists will cite, the probability of all the evil and suffering we observe given theism is just inscrutable. It's the complete range of 0 to 1, that open interval. We can't make it precise to any degree at all. It reflects a state of having absolutely no idea what the likelihood is of the evil we observe given theism. But if we can't say that the likelihood or the probability of the evil we observe given theism is lower than the probability of that evil given naturalism, then we can't make the claim that evil is evidence for, say, naturalism over theism. It requires those previous probabilistic claims. And so skeptical theism wants to sever that atheistic argument from evil at that step of the probabilities. And originally, I thought the reasons that skeptical theists cited for thinking that these likelihoods are just beyond our cognitive abilities were good ones. They would compare it, for example, to we are like a 1-month-old trying to discern the reasons that their parents grabbed what were actually the car keys and walked out the door without even having the concept of car keys or the door. Clearly, the 1-month-old is going to have absolutely no idea what the reasons are for the parents' actions. And then we think about the cognitive gap between ourselves and God, and it has to be even larger than that, right? And so we just can't say that whether or not God has morally sufficient reasons, moral justifications for the evil and suffering in the world, because if he does, they would be things that we couldn't perceive anyway. So they cash this out further with more details and principles of inference about when you can infer something doesn't exist, when you can't see it, and so on and so forth. But the point is, I found that persuasive, and I thought that was a nice, tight little bow that the theist could tie on the problem of evil. But now I think that skeptical theism faces a decisive objection, which is that it seems to imply that no matter the magnitude, duration, or intensity of suffering that we could ever observe, we would never reach a point where we had evidence for atheism, evidence for God's non-existence. And that strikes me as absurd. So I think there's a reductio ad absurdum here of the core skeptical theistic argument. It seems to imply that for any logically possible magnitude of suffering, it would be equally inscrutable given theism, and therefore equally non-evidence for atheism. But that's wrong. I mean, if the universe were filled with an infinite number of conscious creatures that experienced nothing but unfathomable torture for billions and billions and trillions of years, skeptical theism, the machinery of it, still seems to return the result that this would be no evidence for atheism, and that is wrong. That's incorrect. Now, I mean, I made that claim in different contexts, and I've had reviewers of papers where I've contended that, say, well, what difference could the magnitude of duration of evil make? Well, I don't know how to work out the details, but I just ask you, contemplate that scenario and see if you could really tell me with a straight face that that wouldn't be any evidence at all of God's non-existence. And so I no longer know how to fit the pieces together, because I find the initial argument about cognitive gaps or cognitive distance from us and God, I find that plausible, and yet it leads to, apparently, highly implausible results. And I don't know at present how to fit them together. So I would no longer affirm skeptical theism. It's made the problem of evil more pronounced for me, and it's now an open question more than it used to be.
That's a good example of one of the tools that philosophers have, because I think at the end of your argument here, you rely on an intuition, right? Mm-hmm. Because the people that review the papers were saying, well, what does it change? So for people that have no idea about the arguments used in philosophy, can you show us a few tools that you have? Because there is intuitions, but everything is not based on intuitions. Otherwise, it would be, I mean, everybody would be a philosopher.
Right. No, that's an excellent question. I don't know much about metaphilosophy, which has actually become its own subdiscipline of philosophy, which is the study of philosophical methods as such, just in the abstract. Like, what is it the philosopher does? But I do have fairly strong opinions just because I've been doing philosophy for a long time. And I'm convinced that all philosophical arguments ultimately bottom out in a seeming, that is to say, a claim about the way something seems. Now, in standard usage, I think anyway, intellectual seemings, like when we contemplate the proposition that 2 + 2 = 4, or that a contradiction can't be true, those aren't perceptual seemings. We're not using our senses to get at that, but they still seem right. And so philosophers call that an intuition. So intuitions are subsets of seemings. And then there are perceptual seemings. It seems to me that there's an iPhone camera about 2 feet away from my face. And I think that all philosophical arguments ultimately bottom out or end, or I suppose begin, depending on how you look at it, with a seeming. This seems right to me, and I will build from this. So that's the first point. Seemings and intuitions specifically are part and parcel of, or indispensable elements of the philosophical methodology. But from there, how do you build from the seemings? You do so through deductive or inductive arguments. And you aim to connect things together through conceptual analysis in as clear a way as you can. So a lot of what philosophers do is they think about problems and try to carefully discern their conceptual implications as compared to the scientist, for example, who has like empirical data to go on. That's not always a clean and fast distinction between science and philosophy. But often what the philosopher does is they take these very base level seemings and they say, what follows from this? And the reason that can still be productive, even if two people claim to have two different seemings about, say, whether there's free will, is they might have a lot of other shared sets of beliefs about what seems right that they can then argue about whether or not those shared sets support the initial seeming or not, whether there's free will, for example. And so as long as there's some common ground between two philosophers, they can try to use that common ground using the tools of conceptual analysis, inductive logic, deductive logic, to try and show that their viewpoint on a matter, what seems right to them, is more justified. That's a rough and ready statement about how philosophy works.
When you say that there are seemings, I think it sounds very extremely subjective. It's you have those seemings, I have another point of view, and so on. But I think what you mean is most people would use some kind of things that we consider as true. And it might be that it's more objective than just the subjective view that you have on the topic, right? For example, if I say, if I say all humans are mortal, that's a true statement that we consider it's true, because we never had a case where it's not true, but that would still be a seeming. It's just that we objectively agree that it seems like this. Or do you see it differently as truth and seeming as two different concepts?
Well, what seems to be true can turn out to be false. So I wouldn't want to identify what seems to be true with the truth itself. Rather, I would just say that the way something seems is, all things being equal, justification for believing that things are that way. So if it seems to me, and this can differ in strength depending on the strength of the seeming, it seems to me that 2 + 2 = 4. And if ultimately that's like a basic mathematical axiom, and I know it's not, but ultimately you'll get to similar basic mathematical axioms. And how do we know they're true? Because they just overwhelmingly seem true. And absent any reason to think that we are being misled, or that we're hallucinating, or that we're delusional, or that we suffer from cognitive impairments, we are justified in accepting the results of the intellectual intuition. I think that's ultimately our justification for believing that there's a world of physical objects around us. It seems that there are. We have these sensory experiences, and we have no reason usually to think that we're hallucinating. So I think that ultimately is what lies at the foundation of all of our knowledge and all of our beliefs. And I made this claim, for example, to Alex Malpass maybe almost 2 years ago now. And he said, well, no, but we can judge theories based on their internal coherence. And I said, but that's just pushing the problem back a step. For how do you know that internal coherence is an indication of truth? How do you know that contradictory theories can't be true? Well, because there's a powerful inclination to think that upon contemplating it. It just seems right. And I think that while initially that might make the foundations of our knowledge sound rather tenuous, I think that once we come to realize that the principles of logic and mathematics ultimately have as their justification the seeming, I think you should reason in reverse. Okay, so it must be that seemings as such can yield quite secure knowledge. It's just, the point I'm just getting at is that if two people disagree, and they say they're trained philosophers, and they can go back and forth carefully and consistently, here's my argument. Why do you think that? Well, I think that because of this. Okay, well, but why do you think that? Well, because of these further claims. Ultimately, that dialectic is going to bottom out in a seeming. Now, hopefully, it's one that the two people share, and then they can build from that to try and get to consensus further down the line. But they might not. It might just be that at base, the viewpoint seems different. The relevant proposition, its truth seems different to these two people, and then they can't make any further progress. But the hope is that most of the time, or much of the time, you can make progress.
Mm-hmm. So the seeming is the highest. How to say that? It's still the thing that we're most certain of, right?
It is the thing that lies at the foundation of our set of beliefs. The things that we use as inputs to further arguments for other beliefs, but they do not themselves have any further support.
Okay, because as I see it usually, for non-philosophers, the difference between the philosopher and the non-philosopher is the skeptical bar, which is much higher for philosophers than for other people. For example, with the laws of nature, we went to school and they were saying there is this law of nature, gravity pulls the objects to another mass and so on. And we said, okay, well, it's all fine. I can explain a lot of things with this, so I'm going to take it for granted. And now the philosopher comes in and says, well, that maybe there is more to it than we think. What is exactly this law of nature? So the skeptical threshold is much higher. And then that's where there is a point where the philosopher cannot say, well, it's true that it's so, or usually doesn't say directly this, but would use the term seeming, right?
I think that's right. I think good philosophers, anyway, tend to have a much higher bar for the acceptance of a belief than non-philosophers, just because you want your foundations and your viewpoints to be as securely you want your beliefs to have as secure a foundation as possible and to have the greatest likelihood of truth. And so for that, you have to be more rigorous than if you just sort of adopted the beliefs, the religious beliefs, for example, of your parents, just because that's what they taught you and you stayed in that culture. Ideally, the philosopher would say, let me take a step back and examine the reasons for these beliefs with careful scrutiny. So I think that's right.
And do you have any non-philosophy friends? Do you have people that are really outside of the domain and that you have to talk to?
Most of my friends.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you keep them? How do you avoid making them run away because they're just being so frustrated by your skeptical threshold?
That's a good question. I mean, they don't run away. So clearly I'm doing something right. I think because there are two different modes, I think, for many philosophers. There's the philosopher's mode that you enter when you're engaging with another philosopher, when you're writing a paper, when you're sitting for an interview. And then you take that hat off and you enter the regular person mode. I mean, I'm still like analytical in, I suppose, in everyday life, but I don't press people for the same level of precision of argumentation that I would a philosopher who gave me their paper and asked for feedback. So in everyday life, I'm just not at that level. You know, if I'm discussing what we should have for dinner tonight, you know, and what tastes better and what would be best. Like, I'm not going to break it down into like 3 arguments and list off my premises. Some people do that, and those people suck. I mean, you have to be able to turn it off and to just kind of be a regular person. And it's not like I'm being inauthentic. That really is who I am. It's just, it's 2 different authentic and real manners of engagement that I exist in. And you know, it's a continuum. It's not a binary of 2 different things. If I'm sitting down with a scientist to discuss something about cosmology, I'll absolutely engage fully with like very carefully precise intellectual questions, but that's because that's where they are too. You gotta meet people where they're at, I think is what I would say. And not every topic is amenable to rigorous intellectual examination. Like, I mean, some people do. I remember I had some friends in high school who I won't name, who everything was a debate. Everything, every little thing. And I personally, I don't think that's a good way to live life. I think it's aggravating, annoying, and it pushes people away. So I think the key, okay, here I'm circling in on a more concrete answer. The key is to realize when it's a debate and when it's not, and to act accordingly.
Well, if you find the balance, I think that's good for you, and you still have your friends. So I guess it's working out.
Yeah, and you know, I think I think anybody in any discipline, not just philosophy, has a level of expertise on those sets of issues that people outside the discipline won't have. And so, if the conversation turns to philosophical topics, you've got to be able to temper your contributions so that you can meet people where they're at, I think is fundamentally the point. But then once topics go outside the scope of philosophy, like, you know, what movie should we go see tonight, or what TV show is the best one, that's not exactly something that I'm studied in. And so I won't automatically have like some rigorous argument or approach. And so anyway, I think that gets it something of an answer.
And I think just to complement that, because there's the risk of sounding pedantic when we say, well, you know, we need to match them where they are. The thing is simply, as I understand it, it's simply that it's another pair of glasses that you set up when you're into philosophy, and you're going to go into the nitty-gritty details, into definitions and so on, which is very important when we want to investigate the topic. But for many other topics, it's also good to simply have a discussion, try to understand what the other believes and why do they believe that. It's more than a discovery part. I mean, not putting words in your mouth, but just saying that, that there is also the exploration of the beliefs of others to try to understand what convinced them. That's usually
I think that's an important correction. Yeah, I don't want to come off as pedantic. But I think the more fundamental point is just that not everything is philosophy, and not every topic of conversation is a philosophical conversation. And so I think that insofar as I'm talking with other people and talking about life, talking about personal experiences, and engaging with others, that often is not through debating the merits of internalist epistemology or the Kalam cosmological argument or moral realism. It's on other issues that fall outside the scope of that, four-tiered distinction between the subdisciplines of philosophy. And so there's just no real challenge for me. The challenge, I suppose, is if a conversation turns broadly philosophical, the question is, how hard am I gonna go? And I think if you want to have friends, you can't try to win all the time. So that's what I mean about meeting people where they're at.
I just wanted to clarify, and I didn't see, I got your point fully. I didn't think that it was pedantic at all. But I wanted to clarify because often what I also realize is I'm getting excited about some philosophical concepts, and then I go out there, I talk to people, and I sound like a conspiracy theorist. Because, for example, when I'm not convinced, but I appreciate the arguments for anti-realism for science. And also, I like the distinction with Kant of the noumena and the phenomena. I found it very interesting, and the problems of the external world and so on. So this is something that usually it's fine when we are discussing with people that are into philosophy. When you go out there and you say, well, science maybe is not true, and maybe there's no external world, and those kind of topics make you sound like a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
And so often this is where I want to clarify some points on this, because there is the intellectual discussion, and then there is the perception of people that see some dogma that they hold because there is no justification for it, and they feel attacked by topics that philosophers talk about. Do you also see that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is another illustration of where you've got to exercise judgment about whether or not it's worth having that debate. For instance, scientific realism versus anti-realism. If a topic of conversation comes up about, did you see what the James Webb telescope just discovered? Isn't that crazy? All things being equal, it's probably not the time to launch into your careful case for constructive empiricism, because you realize, I mean, it's okay to tell people what you think. I'm actually in general not convinced that scientific theories are actually true. And then if they ask you, well, why? And you can tell them. And then as they continue to ask, you can keep telling them. But you don't want to start there, because that's just overwhelming people who don't have the background knowledge. It's not a question of intelligence. It's a question of just expertise and having the requisite background knowledge to call you if you're making a bad argument. But if they've never thought about these things before, they might not necessarily be able to do that. So I think that when engaging in topics that have a philosophical component or overlap, don't start out by laying out the full depth of your philosophical acumen and thoughts on the topic, because I just know this from experience. Often people, if nothing else, not just will it isolate people, often people don't care. It's too abstract, it's too much. And so you want the conversation to be mutual. You don't want it to be a monologue. Yeah.
Good lesson. I need to practice it now.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this just because I thought of it. I knew these things before, but I always am reacquainted with this fact when I go to the beginning of the academic year, each year, they host freshers events for new master's and PhD students. And part and parcel of that little dance that you do every time you meet somebody is, hi, what's your name? What do you study? What's your PhD in? And inevitably, if I say philosophy, they'll say, oh, what specifically? And I've learned to dial it down to like at most a 30-second spiel, because that can hold them. And then if they want to ask further and they're actually interested, their eyes don't go dark, then it's very exciting and you can do that. But, if I try to start out with the 5-minute version, that just bores people, most people, because, these are very specific interests, just like anything. If a microbiologist sat down with me and I said, what do you do? And then they launched into a 10-minute detailed explanation of everything I do. Yeah, about 1 minute in, I'd be like, I gotta get out of here. So it's not meant to come across as, look at philosophers and how high and mighty they are. I have to dumb it down. No, it's just a question of interest and specificity.
And do you think that it's niche philosophy? Because now we can see, or maybe it's just because I'm looking at a lot of philosophy online, but I think that there are some successful content creators online. Yeah, Joe Foley, Alex O'Connor. Yeah. I think that the question becomes more relevant. Do you think it's still niche or that it's growing?
So there's the question of like whether philosophy is niche as a claim about philosophy itself. Like, is philosophy a very specific discipline with little overlap with other disciplines? And then there's the question of whether philosophy is niche in the sociological sense. Do most people have some interest in philosophy, or is it only a very narrow set of people that are interested in philosophy? And so looking at that second question, which I think is what you're getting at, apparently lots of people are interested in philosophy. I mean, the Joe Foley, Alex O'Connor have huge platforms that focus on philosophical content. But I think that the key to a successful, if your goal is to have as big a platform, say on YouTube, as possible, you can be philosophical, but you can't focus exclusively on narrow academic philosophical topics. A lot of Joe Foley's videos, for example, are focused on a philosophical analysis of internet memes, for instance. That's much more interesting, even for me, and much more widely interesting than a philosophical critique of reliabilist epistemology. So I think there's a way to do it. There's a way to market and package philosophy, which is of wide interest, that is viable, absolutely. But if you just were to, say, read off the analytical contents of a philosophy textbook and have those as your titles, that's not going to reach as many people. But the reason I think that philosophy doesn't have to be of interest to only a very narrow set of people is because of that first question, which is like, what is the relationship between philosophy as a discipline and other disciplines and life as a whole? Philosophy, when you understand what it is so broad in its scope. It intersects with so many issues that there is a home there of a subset of interesting questions for almost anybody. And so you don't have to be interested in the entirety of philosophy in order to find, for example, philosophy of mathematics absolutely fascinating. So I think just given the enormous scope of what philosophy is, there is a place for that of interest for just about everyone. Even if it's something they only focus on in passing or as a hobby, it's still interesting. Whereas I think if you contrast that with microbiology, for example, I think that's just something that a lot of people just won't find interesting. It's incredibly important and vital, maybe even more important than like philosophical analysis, but it's just not going to interest as many people. So I think if you had a YouTube channel focused only on microbiology, there's a hard cap on how big that can go. But I think with philosophy, if marketed with a savvy mind, can get there. And I'm not saying that I have that. I think a lot of my content has skewed towards the abstract and the academic, but I'm working on it.
Well, I think it's good that, there is different sellers selling different stuff. And I think I appreciate that yours is deep and over my head, that it's hard to grasp. So it's very good. And I was thinking about this because in the end, when we say, is it niche or not, science, if we think about science, the real science that is being done academically and in the labs, it's nobody's interested in that. But the Carl Sagan and the Neil deGrasse Tyson and so on, they managed to make it not niche. Like many people are interested in science. So I think that I wonder if this is coming, if this is something that now there are more philosophers. You have so many of them on your podcast. They're open to public philosophy. They're interested into communicating these ideas. I think hopefully this is something that's going to develop in the future.
Yes. I think it's a question of marketability, and because of people like Carl Sagan, Sean Carroll, Neil deGrasse Tyson, they've found a way to package contemporary physics, cosmology, astronomy in a way that is accessible and interesting to a huge number of people. And it's to their credit that they do that. I think Sean Carroll's works are especially lucid and fascinating, and they allow someone without a technical background to really deeply dig into physics and to understand how it all fits together. And I think it is to his credit that he was able to accomplish that. And so I think that if philosophers can similarly model themselves off of that approach, great. That it's to their benefit. I think it just is a question of whether or not someone can come along to figure out a way to do that. And I think people are doing that slowly but surely in more narrowly focused ways for philosophy. And I say, keep giving it a try. I don't know that it will ultimately work. I don't know that there'll be like a Carl Sagan of philosophy, if there hasn't been already. But it's absolutely worth trying. And even if we can't ascend to those heights, I think making as much of philosophy as we can accessible to as many people as possible that's a good thing.
And then for people that want to dive in and go further, what's the benefits for them? You've been studying for, I guess, easily 10 years at least of interest in philosophy. What are the skills that you developed that you think are particularly developed in philosophy?
Like what skills does philosophy develop?
Studying philosophy, yeah.
Well, I can answer that in terms of what I think that it's done for me. And it's made me a clearer thinker. And I know this just compared to 3.5 years ago when I started graduate work to now. I'm so much better at thinking through a complicated set of issues clearly and well without stumbling. I'm not perfect at it, but I'm a lot better. And so I see that directly reflected in the amount of time it takes to write a paper to the same level of sophistication. My very first paper took me a year to write. But now I'm much quicker at spitting something out at the same level of sophistication. And that's just because you learn how to think better. And I think that's of wide applicability, not just to philosophy, but to any set of issues which requires critical thinking, which is most of them. Being able to think at an abstract level or to abstract away from the particularities, to see the connections, to see how the parts fit together, that's huge. That's extremely helpful in just navigating life. The second adjacent skill is verbal and oral communication. Being able to express yourself well and clearly in writing and in speech. Those, I don't think I need to justify, are so valuable in everyday life and in almost any career path. If you can convey what's inside your head clearly, that's a plus 10 to any project or endeavor that you're undertaking, not just for philosophy. So critical thinking on the side of like inside your own mind, and then being able to convey the results of that to other people in writing or in speech are the main benefits, I think, of philosophical analysis, or in terms of like skills that you acquire. Those occur to me.
And you said before, that one of the aim of philosophy, personally, for the person that studies it, is to develop a coherent set of beliefs. I think you hinted at it.
Yeah.
Is that how you see it? Do you see that in the last 10 years or so, you managed to challenge your beliefs and try to develop more justified one?
Yes. I think, like, are you asking about coherence specifically? Or do you mean just
Yep.
like, do you think your beliefs are more justified now, more broadly?
Do you think that it's an aim when you're studying philosophy to develop coherent beliefs in the end?
Yes, coherent and justified. Yes. I think, though, that I have accomplished that by, it's more been, accomplishing that has more been a function of relinquishing beliefs than adding further ones on. I mean, I've always been more of a skeptical person. My threshold for adopting beliefs is very high. But nevertheless, I think there's been a real move in my life towards more tenuous convictions, towards agnosticism, the more I've done philosophy. And so in that respect, my beliefs are more justified because I think that the strength of my conviction is more closely approximating what is objectively warranted by our evidence that we have. I think, in the vast majority of cases, the philosophical issues that arise when trying to answer any of these big picture questions are so complex and nuanced and complicated and big that it is very hard to responsibly infer with a high degree of conviction a particular answer to those questions. And I just infer inductively. I've only really examined in detail a small number of philosophical questions, but every time I have discovered, like underneath the iceberg, so to speak, of my initial impressions, a huge world of complex issues that takes forever to adjudicate. And even then, you've only really adjudicated a tiny part of it. And I have to think that every single other philosophical question that's interesting is like that. And so it's made me, my philosophical studies have made me a more humble person, more agnostic person in most cases. And there are few, relatively few, but some things that I'm quite convinced about. But in most cases, I hold whatever beliefs I do hold tenuously. And in many cases, I'm just agnostic. I just have to say I don't know. It's not as sexy as the person who has a bunch of strongly held convictions and can argue for them well. But I think I have the advantage of actually being in alignment with the reality of our cognitive situation. That we just, these things are too complex most of the time for us to be certain about.
So basically, do you think that studying philosophy brought you clarity, or it kind of like kicked the beliefs that you had and created confusion, and now you're trying to rebuild it, and you know less about the world that you knew before, or that you thought you knew?
There's a sense in which it has contributed both unclarity and clarity to my life. In terms of seeing the truth clearly, I think that sustained philosophical activity and my efforts to think through these things has like blurred my vision of the truth, so to speak, where I used to think, for example, that the earth was 6,000 years old and the rapture was only a couple months away at most, that obviously evolutionary theory was false, and a whole host of other beliefs that go along with the conservative Christian worldview, and I held them with a high degree of conviction. And part of the journey of the last 10 years has been moving away from that entirely towards much less certainty about the vast majority of beliefs that would fall under that heading. And so in that respect, it's a move towards like confusion, as you say, or less clarity. I know less than I thought I did, or I have less firm convictions than I thought I did. But in another, I think, deeper respect, my thinking is much clearer than it used to be. I can navigate complex conceptual terrains much more clearly and adeptly than I used to be able to. I would say that my grasp on like the conceptual landscape of the arguments, the dialectic, the objections, what the possible viewpoints are, how they relate, that is much clearer the more I engage in philosophy. But that doesn't necessarily translate to a firm conviction, to zeroing in on one of those viewpoints in that landscape as the right one. And that's just the nature of the beast, I think. At least for me. I am a skeptical person at heart. My threshold for acceptance is very, very high. And I honestly think at times it's too high. I think there might be an element of irrationality in my cognitive structure, but just in the other direction than what people usually think, where you just kind of accept beliefs at a very low threshold. I think my bar might be too high, and that's for future reflection. But for the time being, the clarity has been wrought at the level of being able to think through the issues and to at least understand how it all relates.
And I think there's one thing that you definitely developed, or at least you own the skill now. It's to debate and discuss challenging topics, emotional topics with others. And especially you're very interested in religion. And so you go against people that might have a negative opinion of religion, or that they simply believe it's false. And you did a debate recently with other philosophy students and philosophers, and you deeply enjoyed it. You said that that was really a good experience for you. How do we get to this level? You know, because usually when people go, if you start talking religion, it might end up. It's a taboo topic for most.
Yes.
And I can think about many other taboo topics. How do we get to the level to be able to have a rational discussion on these tricky topics?
It helps to not be emotionally invested in one's answer and in the specific arguments that one gives for that answer. So, for example, even if you're really emotionally invested in whether God exists, that's fine, at least compared to if you're emotionally invested in whether the Kalam cosmological argument succeeds. And you've got to be honest with yourself. Like, if the thought of a critique of a paper with a title that gets at a critique of the Kalam cosmological argument, if that angers you, if that pisses you off, you are too emotionally tied up in the arguments in a way that I think threatens your objectivity and your ability to think through things well. So I think that distancing yourself, if nothing else, from the specific arguments for your position, not identifying with them, not building your identity around them, is critical. Now, that's I spoke of two different things, two different levels here: the viewpoint and arguments for the viewpoint. That's hard. It's harder to cleanly separate those things, and so I think that as best you can to. Well, you know, I say this, but when it comes to religion, that is an integral part of who we are, often, for most of us. And I think it is with me. So I wouldn't want to say, now that I'm saying it out loud, I wouldn't want to say that, you know, my belief in God is like, it's just kind of an austere intellectual hypothesis that doesn't really impact the way I live. No, it does. It does. It's a core part of who I am. And yet I'm able, most of the time, not all the time, most of the time, to engage in respectful, cordial, substantive conversation about issues implicating God's existence, for example. And I think for me, those two things can coexist because, and I've been honest about this, the ultimate basis of my belief in God, for instance, is not the arguments. It's the experience of God in my life and the fact that I think belief in God makes life better now. Whether it's true or false, it makes life better to believe that it's true, that there is a God. And that is closely related to how we began our conversation, which is avoiding absurdism. I think that, especially in a case where the evidence is ambiguous, there's nothing irrational about adopting the belief, cultivating the belief, that makes life better right now, that has pragmatic benefits. So anyway, to circle back to your question, because those are the ultimate foundation of my belief, I'm not as emotionally tied up in whether the fine-tuning argument works, whether the cosmological argument works, whether the moral argument works, and even objections like the problem of evil, which I suppose I'm a bit more emotionally affected by. But even then, I can come to it in a bit more of a removed way than I think I would be able to if the foundation of my belief in God were the success of those arguments. Then I would have a lot to lose. if those arguments were shown to fail. And I'm not positioning myself as better than anyone, as thinking, no, I would follow the evidence where it leads. I don't know that I would. It's just that my unique setup here allows me to put myself at a greater distance from the specific arguments and treat them more so as an intellectual exercise than I think I would if I said, nope, I believe in God only because I think the fine-tuning argument works. Then it would be much, much harder to extricate myself from the success of that argument.
Mm-hmm. I found that very interesting to hear you talk about this, because what you didn't say was that you talked about the argument itself, what convinces you in the argument, but you didn't talk at all about who is in front of you that you're trying to convince. And I find it funny because usually in discussions, I mean, religious discussion, if there is an atheist and a theist, they're both going to try to say, well, you're stupid to think that, if it's a very base level. And you're stupid to think that. Can't you see that there is suffering in the world and all these things? And the only goal of the discussion is to convince the other. But or not even that. But I think that you totally switched this view of a debate to try to actually, it's the egoistical view of the debate of, I'm going there to try to get information from someone, and then I reconsider my arguments and I say, is it convincing or not?
Right. Well, right. I think that the most you can do to cultivate the possibility, to increase the chances for a productive dialogue, is to, work on yourself and work on the factors with your control, which is about the way that you're approaching the conversation. You can't control what someone else is going to do or say. And if the other person has as their aim winning the argument more than having a quality conversation, a fair-minded, substantive exchange, then I won't have future conversations with them. So I think that you have to acknowledge the real limits of what working on yourself can do. There are some people that just won't respond in kind, and that's okay. That's okay. And you move along. I think that is replying to what you're getting at, or did I misunderstand the point you were making?
No. I mean, the point was simply the change of perspective. When I ask you about how do you deal in debates to not get emotionally involved, you turn to yourself and you said, well, I look at my arguments. I don't need to be too committed, or I should not be too committed to some of the arguments, and I should reconsider. But usually the frustration and the violence comes from the other person that I'm trying to convince and is not responding to reason, and then I'm getting frustrated and so on.
Now that's a good point. I haven't had that experience most of the time. I mean, these in these discussions, debates are relatively new for me. I've only done 2. The vast majority of what I've done is more discussion based, and I think that's where the real fruit of philosophical investigation comes from. I agree with Alex O'Connor that debates as such are mostly about sport. Now, I think when you get 4 philosophers together doing a debate, then it can also be quite substantive. But in a debate context, you're more adopting a view, and usually it's what you actually believe, but you might defend it with more conviction than you otherwise would because it's a debate. That's what you do. You got to represent that position. So I think the discussion model is much more amenable to substantive philosophical exchange. And what I was going to say is, in all of those cases, I'm selecting these people who I will sit and discuss with. And if I think someone is a jerk, then I normally don't talk with them. And also, most of the people I speak to are professional philosophers. Most of the people I have on the podcast are philosophers. And so by the time you get to the level of a professorship in philosophy, you know how to have these conversations. You do it all the time. So it's much easier to trust that the rules of decorum and mutual engagement and blah, blah, blah will be followed. That hasn't happened every time. There are a handful of times where I walked away from a podcast and going, I don't think I will talk to them again. And I will leave it to you, the careful listener, to determine whom I'm talking about. But I think, I mean, then what do you do if you are sitting down to talk to someone and they start hurling accusations and insults at you? What do you do? Well, I mean, then you just do your best to practice maturity and stay grounded in what you know about yourself and leave the conversation. without sacrificing your integrity. I sound like I'm preaching, but I have not always done this, but my goal, even when, encountering somebody who, unforeseen by me, is a jerk, is to respond in whatever way I feel appropriate, short of compromising my integrity, my values. I don't want to ever do or say something that I would look back on and go, that did not represent who I really am. That did not represent what I think is important, my moral values. And so I just think staying committed to your integrity, to not engage at the level of insult when you're insulted, that sort of thing, that's important. To be able to walk away from the conversation and, a year later say, I don't regret anything that I said or did. Again, this is kind of preachy, but I've not lived up to that perfectly at all, but I have tried. I've tried.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think I can only recommend the viewers and listeners to go and check your podcast, the Uncertainty Podcast, which represents exactly your sets of beliefs as I understand it now. And it's a very sophisticated discussions, I think still accessible, but indeed it goes into the details of those philosophical questions. And yeah, do you have anything that you want to plug for that?
No, I think I'm nothing if not consistent. I think the as you say, the name of my podcast is the Uncertainty Podcast. And when I was thinking for the longest time, what should I call it before I'd actually started anything, and mulled over several different options. Like, no, those all suck. And then the Uncertainty Podcast came to mind. It slowly morphed out of just the word uncertainty. I was like, what can I do with that? What can I do with that? And I thought maybe uncertain investigations. And I thought, that sounds a little corny. And then I thought just uncertainty. Well, that doesn't roll off the tongue as well. But the Uncertainty Podcast, I think when I figured it out, I thought that's the one, because it represents my ethos and just who I am so well. I'm an uncertain, hapless philosopher. So if that is something you can identify with, then that's the podcast for you.
Well, thank you very much, Miles.
Absolutely. Thank you.